Hi there, Shane and Caitlin here, and welcome to Science on the Table.
The podcast that covers all things South African science, where we take the tough stuff and break it down into bite-sized bits so you don't have to.
That's right, from soup to nuts. So let's lay it all out on the table.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated institutions or organizations. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the content shared is for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice. Some information may become outdated as new research emerges. Always consult primary sources or professionals for advice related to your field of interest. The hosts are not liable for any errors or omissions in the content, and listeners should critically evaluate the information presented.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode. Today we have Professor Jacquie van der Waals as a guest on the podcast, and we are very lucky and excited to have Jacquie on today's podcast. Jacquie is a professor in plant pathology. So she did a PhD in plant pathology, but she's going to tell you all about it. And she's going to talk generally about what a plant pathologist does and maybe elaborate a little bit on citrus diseases and potato diseases. So Jacquie, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. If you can maybe give us a bit of background on what you've studied, where you've obtained your qualifications, just so that the listeners can get to know you a little bit.
Thank you very much, Shane. Thanks for that invitation. Yes, as you said, I have a PhD in plant pathology, but to go back a little bit, I first did a BSc agriculture in plant pathology at the University of Pretoria. Then I went on to do my MSc agriculture in plant pathology. And then subsequent to that, I did my PhD also in plant pathology, also at the University of Pretoria, although I did do a brief stint in the beginning of my PhD at Penn State University in the States.
That sounds very, very cool, Jacquie. Thank you for that. If there is anyone, out there, the kids that are listening or the adults that are listening that might want to have a little bit of a career change, is there another way that you could go about becoming a plant pathologist, or is that kind of the standard method that people in your field take in order to get where you are?
Yeah, thanks. Look, you don't need a PhD to be a plant pathologist. You probably don't need an MSc either, but you do need an undergraduate qualification. So the postgrad qualifications will depend on where you want to be one day in your career. So if you have a PhD, then it's more a research-focused career. Most people who are plant pathologists do the BSc agriculture stream, and there are a couple of universities that offer it, but it is also possible to do a BSc in something like plant and soil sciences. And then in the honors year, one can specialize in plant pathology. So it really depends on the university that one is at and when you actually decide to go into plant pathology. Yeah, so we call the agriculture degree the vocational degree, and the others are more academic, although in the end it doesn't really make too much of a difference.
So you are on the academic side of things, or what are you currently?
Yes, exactly. So after my PhD, I got a job at the University of Pretoria as a lecturer, and then subsequent to that, senior lecturer, and then professor. So that's the academic stream. I'm currently employed as the program manager of pre-harvest diseases. So it's a research job with some management. So I would also consider that academic more than a practicing plant pathologist who is in the field practicing their degree.
Jacquie, so you've mentioned the term plant pathologist a lot, and you've briefly touched on what a plant pathologist does. Can you maybe elaborate on the extent of the work that they do, and what are all the day-to-day tasks of a plant pathologist? If maybe you can touch both on academic and I want to say a field plant pathologist.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Shane. Yeah. So to start off with, A plant pathologist is basically a plant doctor. So where you have a doctor for human diseases or a vet for animal diseases, you have a plant pathologist for plant diseases. So for those who are not that familiar with the field, plants also get sick just as we do. And in order to produce enough food to feed all the people on Earth, and animals too, we need to ensure that the plants are healthy and producing as much yield as they possibly can. So that's where the field of plant pathology comes in, and why it's necessary. So in terms of what a plant pathologist does, it's very varied. It really depends on where one ends up working. It ranges from people in academia or in research, like I am, where you're actually on the cutting edge of the latest developments in terms of managing plant diseases, what products can be used to manage it, how growers can change their cultural practices, breeding for resistance to certain diseases. Yeah, so basically that would be research. And then there are other fields where, like you said, more in the field, where you might be consulting for farmers and giving them advice on how to control certain diseases or which plants are most suited for a certain area to avoid certain diseases. There are also seed companies. So a plant pathologist could be employed at a seed company, and that often the work there relates to screening the seeds before they go to farmers for pests and pathogens in the seed. So you don't want to send seed out that's contaminated and then it's planted in the field and then eventually results in an epidemic in the field. Another option would be working for an agrochemical or a biological control company. So these are companies that sell chemicals or biological control agents to farmers for them to use, and then they obviously give advice to the farmers as to how to apply them, when to apply them, how to manage those products correctly. There are also some people that work in quality control, so that can be quite varied. I know some of the big supermarket chains will employ plant pathologists to check that the produce that they get from the farmer has been produced correctly with not too many chemicals and that it's not contaminated with some kind of plant pathogen. Then there are also people that work in the more regulatory side of things, so where they're involved in compiling laws for the spread and the movement of plant pathogens, whether it be locally or internationally. So some of them are involved with very high level committees and discussions in terms of international trade of plant products, because we don't want to export something that another country doesn't want, and we don't want to import a product that's contaminated with something that we don't have. So as you can see, there are so many different options. I haven't even touched on all of them. So it's a very varied field, and if one studies plant pathology, really the world is your oyster. You can work just about anywhere. You'll never be without a job, because we need to feed so many mouths and we need to make sure the produce that gets onto the plate is healthy. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I never realized that the field is so big, and that being a plant pathologist actually opens up a whole world of so many different work opportunities. Just on that one point, that where you've mentioned the regulatory side of things, I'm assuming it's important for people not to smuggle with plants, take plants out of their natural habitat, try and grow them in different regions, so that we also don't, aside from purging or disrupting the ecosystem, but we could also transfer like plant pathogens and also cause an upset in the new ecosystem or environment.
You're quite right. That's exactly it. So if we think of plant pathogens, they can basically be latent, in other words, not showing symptoms in various types of plant material. And so say I go overseas and I visit whichever country, and I like the look of a certain plant or a flower or whatever, and I think, well, I'm just going to bring some of the seeds back. Nobody's going to know. I'm going to plant them in my garden, and then I'm going to have this crop or this flower or whatever it is. I may inadvertently be bringing back plant pathogens that we don't have in South Africa. And that could cause a major problem. So it's exactly as you said, we don't want to bring pathogens into the country that we don't have here, because it could cause havoc in our agricultural production, or, as you mentioned, ecosystems. Ecosystems can be changed if a pathogen comes in and kills off native plants. So yes, it's very, very important to stick to the regulations, and that's why smuggling of plant material or just bringing in plant material without the required certificates, etc., is really dangerous. That's also why most countries have very strict import requirements, and also at customs they're very strict. That's why they have sniffer dogs, to make sure that nobody brings something into that country that isn't already there, because it could have really devastating consequences.
And this, listeners, is the whole reason we started the podcast, is to try and show the average person out there how many steps there are in just securing something as simple as like a couple of groceries at the grocery store, like your fresh produce and so forth. A lot of people don't think about the amount of work that goes into that, the regulations that go around that. And that's pretty much why we started this passion project, is just to make people a little bit more aware of how lucky we are to have these systems in place and the people behind the scenes that are securing these things for us, so that we have a variety of different foods and so forth that we can eat without being in danger of, you know, the little hidden things that we didn't know about. So thank you for that. That's amazing. Then I have a multifaceted question here. So I apologize if it's too much in one go, but we want to know why or how do plants get sick? And then what kind of testing can you do to identify if the plant is unhealthy?
So, as with humans and animals, plants are infected by different kinds of organisms, and some of these can make them sick. So the most common types of plant pathogens are generally fungi. These are different to bacteria. Fungi aren't generally responsible for a lot of human or animal diseases, but they do cause a lot of plant diseases. Then the second type of microorganism would be bacteria. So they're also responsible for a number of different plant diseases, quite difficult to control. And then the other one is viruses. And I think post-COVID, most people have a good understanding of what a virus is. And there are viruses that infect plant diseases as well. But then there are also other things like nematodes or roundworms, sometimes they're referred to as roundworms, that can infect plants and make them sick. And then, of course, insects, but I'm specifically focusing on the microorganisms in this talk, but insects can also cause plants to get sick. And then some of the abiotic factors, that's non-living factors. So too much water, too little water, not enough nutrients, not enough light or air, or whatever the case may be. But in terms of a plant pathologist, we focus on the microorganisms. So fungi, bacteria, viruses, and then nematodes. So to answer your question as to how they get sick, well, there are many different pathways as to how these organisms actually infect plants. One pathway would be, for example, via seed, and that's why I mentioned seed testing and quality seed production earlier. So where the pathogen is actually transmitted in a seed, so it's gone through the whole life cycle of the previous generation of plants, and then it's found in or on the seed. And when you plant that seed, then the plant's already infected with the pathogen. Another route would be, for example, by what we call soil-borne pathogens, so pathogens that live in the soil. And then when you plant a crop in that soil, the pathogen will infect normally via the roots. Another mechanism would be wind dispersal, or even rain splash or water dispersal, where the pathogens move through water or are blown by wind, and then they land on a plant and are able to infect that plant. We as humans are also responsible for the movement of plant pathogens. So, for example, as I've mentioned, if you take an infected plant from one area and take it to another area, you could inadvertently introduce a disease there. And then this pathogen would again be spread by wind or water. Insects are also a pathway by which the pathogens are spread. That's another option. So these are just a couple of ways in which the pathogens are introduced to a plant. And then they will infect in various mechanisms or in various ways, and then produce symptoms and cause the plant to become sick and sometimes die. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the different types of organisms that infect plants and how they get to the plants. Then your second question was testing, or how do we basically diagnose plant diseases? The first could be a visual diagnosis where you can actually look at the plant and you can see there's something wrong. So they might have lesions. So that would be like spots, brown spots, necrotic lesions, or the yellow spots, that would be chlorotic. So we can actually see that there's something wrong with it. Other cases may be that the plant wilts. That would be, for example, if there's a root infection and the pathogen moves up in the vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, and blocks it, and then the plant can't take up enough water, so then they might wilt. In other cases, they might start rotting, so that would be quite an easy thing to see. In other circumstances, you would see that the leaves start changing color, or they get sort of a mosaic pattern on them. That would be characteristic of a virus disease. So those are just some of the ways that that plant diseases can be visually, I wouldn't say diagnosed, but noticed. Then in terms of the testing to actually determine what it is that's causing that plant disease, the first most basic method that's been around for many, many years is what we call isolation and then identification of the pathogen. So where you would take a part of the sick plant and make an isolation onto a specific growing media. So something that will allow the plant pathogen to grow. And then from there, one will identify what it is. Is it a fungus or a bacterium? For viruses, it's a bit different. You can't use that method. And then the newer techniques or molecular techniques. So this is by use of PCR, for example. So again, if you think back to COVID, the testing was a quantitative PCR that they did to determine if you were infected with the COVID. Now we have the same for plant diseases, where some of the plant tissue is then used in a PCR or a quantitative PCR or another kind of molecular technique to actually look or to identify the genes in that specific pathogen, and then give you a very distinct answer as to what is found in that plant. So then you can actually identify the specific organism that's causing the plant disease. So those are just some of the ways in which we can actually identify what's making the plant sick.
Thanks, Jacquie. You've shed some good light on how pathogens spread and what to look for when your plant is sick and possibly suspecting that there's a microbe or a microorganism involved in causing your plant to look a bit worse for wear. I just think about my own gardening and generally plants and fruit and veg. I often just overlook these spots, and I touch one plant and I transfer it to another place in the garden without really thinking about possibly spreading pathogens, because I'm sure some of these pathogens can also hop onto other plants. Not necessarily
definitely.
literally, but and then just cross infection. Another question that I have, which you have alluded to a little bit earlier on in terms of imports and exports. How strict is South Africa on their import and exports of specifically fruit and veg? Because I know we do supply or export to a lot of countries, and we obviously import a lot of fruit and veg from other countries. Just in terms of how strict they are to protect crop security, what are the laws that are in place?
So let's start with imports. We have very strict regulations in place, very strict guidelines for imports, because we don't want to bring anything into the country that isn't already here. However, because we have relatively porous borders, in other words, many of the borders with our neighboring countries are not that well patrolled or regulated, and people can walk over the border. Not a lot, but a couple of plant pathogens or insects that infect plants are basically brought into the country in that way. So it's difficult to regulate our borders 100%. The regulation at the ports is very strict. So we will not bring anything import officially in official terms. We will not bring anything into the country that is contaminated with a pest or a pathogen that we don't have. So the introductions would be people that don't know what they're doing. So they will walk over the border, maybe carrying a bag of tomatoes or whatever the case may be, and they, out of ignorance, they don't know that they're introducing a new pest or pathogen into the country. So that's the unfortunate thing with many countries where we have land borders and people can easily come into the country carrying or smuggling even something that is contaminated. So that is a difficult one. And of course, for pathogens and insects that are wind dispersed, we can't stop that. We can't stop the wind from blowing from one country to another. It's the same with water. If it flows down through the river, there's nothing we can do about that. But as I've said, the imports via the ports and so harbors and airports they're quite strict. So we have sniffer dogs, for example, and we have other methods to test and make sure that the products that we're importing are free from pathogens that we don't have. So our export crops are also very strictly regulated. So now obviously it's the country that is importing that will impose the rules. So if we export to a certain country, they will have rules as to what may or may not be in that export product. And then we have to comply with those rules. And if we don't, then they will not accept the product, they will send it back. So our fruit that is exported is very, very strictly monitored before it's even put onto a ship. It's monitored on this side by our government authorities to make sure that we don't have whatever it is that the importing country doesn't want. Because if we were to import a shipment of something to another country and they detect a pathogen in that shipment that they don't want, they will send it straight back and then it's at our cost. So our exports are also very, very strictly monitored. As I've said, the government authorities check, and some of the local industry authorities, so for that specific commodity, will check what is being loaded onto the ship before it leaves the harbor. So the rules are set at a very high level. And again, it's the importing country that determines what they will allow into their country. But yeah, very strict guidelines in place, and we adhere to them as best we can.
And then, Jacquie, how common are large-scale plant disease outbreaks? And do they pose any risk to humans in terms of like food poisoning or anything along those lines?
Okay, so in commercial agriculture, we don't often these days see large-scale outbreaks, epidemic proportions of plant diseases because they are very well managed. We do see diseases in crops every single season. That's what happens. But in terms of epidemics that will wipe out an entire crop, it's very, very rare. As I've said, because there's so much research that's gone into it over the past 100 years, we just manage it. So plant diseases occur every single season. It's like a human disease. Every single year, almost the whole population will get a cold or a flu or something like that. But it's not at the proportion of killing off people, for example. So it's the same with the plants. We will see plant diseases every single season because that's the way it is. And it's almost impossible to completely protect a plant. So there are some diseases that are far more devastating, and those ones normally have a lot of researchers working on them to try and make sure that we don't get those kinds of diseases in our crops. But the large-scale outbreaks that we saw in the 1700s and even some of the early 1900s are not common anymore. In terms of the risk for humans, most plant pathogens don't pose a risk to human health, except for those that produce mycotoxins. So mycotoxins are toxins that are produced by a plant pathogen, normally a fungus, and it's toxic to humans or animals. So a very good example would be, for example, aflatoxin. That's caused by a fungus, and it's often found in peanut butter. So in areas where peanut production is not well managed and this fungus is not kept under control, peanuts will be produced and often made into peanut butter, and they will contain a toxin. So there have been quite a number of outbreaks in Africa in cheap sources of peanut butter, where the production of the peanuts was not done properly, and then the peanut butter contains an aflatoxin. And this toxin is carcinogenic. It can cause cancer. It can cause all sorts of other complications in humans and in animals. So there are some examples where a plant pathogen can infect, or not infect, but affect humans, cause them to become ill as well. But for the most part, plant pathogens don't actually affect humans at all. So it's more that it affects the plant, or it makes it unpalatable, or you get a loss of yield. So we wouldn't eat that produce in any case.
So we've been talking about plant pathogens a lot, and obviously we need to control for those pathogens. So in terms of pesticide use, how do, for example, organic and inorganic pesticides, and maybe if you can define those, affect our crops? I'm just thinking about something that was in the news recently about the spaza shop deaths. And does that link up with this pesticide use? And if I remember correctly, it's linked to organophosphate poisoning.
So that case, particularly, as you mentioned, was an organophosphate. Now, that's normally used to control insects. They are supposed to be very strictly monitored, and they shouldn't be applied a certain number of days before harvest. But in this case, it was probably small-scale farmers or farmers who were not checking what they were doing, either due to ignorance or just ignoring the law. And the pesticide got into the produce. So this should not happen if one adheres to the regulations. So each product that is sprayed, whether it be chemically synthesized, in other words, inorganic, or a biological product, has very strict guidelines for application. So it would say apply, for example, twice in a season and stop application 20 days before harvest. This is just a random thumbs-up example. Things like that spaza shop incident should not happen if everybody obeys the rules. But unfortunately, not everybody obeys rules, and then we often get such negative consequences. So you asked about organic and inorganic. I'd rather refer to it as chemical versus biological products. So there are I'm going to refer to fungicides. Those are products that are applied to plants to control fungal pathogens. We get some chemical fungicides that are manufactured in factories or in labs, and they are normally very what we call target specific. So they will only be active against the specific pathogen that they were designed to affect. And if they are used properly, then they shouldn't have an effect on humans. However, a number of them have been flagged, especially by the EU, as endocrine disrupting compounds, and they are being removed from the market globally. So some of the more dangerous products are being removed from the market, and their idea is to get rid of these products by 2030. South Africa also adheres to those guidelines, especially when we're exporting crops to the EU. Then you have other products that are generally known as softer chemicals. Some of these could be, for example, what we call generally regarded as safe, or the acronym is GRAS chemicals, where they are chemicals that are generally regarded as safe, so they don't need to be tested. So we know, for example, that they're safe to use. They won't affect a human or an animal or birds or frogs or whatever the case may be. They are also being used in agriculture, and the move in general is to move towards more of these and use fewer of the harsh synthetic chemicals. And then the other group of products that is also used to control plant diseases and also insects are biological control agents. So a biological control agent is usually a product that contains one or more microorganisms that will then counteract the plant pathogen. So does this in many ways. It could be by means of parasitism or competing for certain nutrients, or by producing an antibiotic that infects or affects the plant pathogen, many different modes of action. And these products are also applied to crops. So they're safe for humans and animals, they're safe for the plants, but they affect the plant pathogen. There are many products on the market, and as I've mentioned, the move in general in agriculture, including in South Africa, is to move towards a more softer approach of controlling plant diseases and insects as well. So where farmers will not use as many of the harsh synthetic chemicals as we did in the past, and they move towards grass chemicals and biological control agents. You get some growers that have an integrated strategy where they use a few chemicals where necessary, and then they use some grass chemicals and they use some biological control agents. And that's normally ideal because then you get the best of all of the different products. Some growers are more reluctant to move towards using softer approaches. And then we do have some growers that are completely what we would call organic, which means they don't use any synthetic chemicals. So they might still use grass products, which are also chemicals, but they're not synthetically produced. Yeah, so there's a great variety of options to control plant pathogens.
Thank you, Jacquie. That's really informative. Before we move on from the pesticides or the pesticide topic, I just want to know, generally speaking, in the household, when we use pesticides in the garden, I know we should take general precautions, and I know some of them can be quite harsh in terms of safety. Are those also as strictly monitored by the government or regulated, or are they, I know with sometimes some of these, not homeopathic medicine, but like human medicine, supportive medicine, a lot of those aren't really as regulated, because you do find that some of those products are still on the market, even though they contain no active ingredient that'll work against whatever you have going on in your system. Is that the same for pesticides and controlling plant diseases?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. That is interesting. It's exactly the same. One can walk into your local nursery or even supermarket and buy various pesticides that you can use against pathogens or insects or weeds in your garden. And a lot of them are actually really quite dangerous. So they're sold and there are strict usage instructions on the label, but it's up to the user to actually abide by those guidelines and regulations. So it's exactly the same as some kind of medicine that you could buy in your local pharmacy. If it's used properly, it's fine. If it's abused and not used according to the instructions, then it can cause damage. So yeah, it's exactly the same. So if one does buy some kind of a pesticide, whether it be a fungicide or an insecticide or herbicide, one needs to really very carefully read the instructions. I think in general, for a garden, for somebody just even with a veggie patch, it's not necessary to use such harsh chemicals because you're not dealing with hectares of a single crop that could be wiped out and cause millions of rands of loss. So it's better not to actually use too many of these harsh chemicals in your own garden or veggie patch, but rather if you have a diseased plant, maybe remove it or cut off the leaves or something, whatever the case may be, or buy something softer. You can ask at the local nursery for a softer approach. So you're quite right, Shane. It's exactly like you were saying. The analogy with human medication is perfectly right.
We mentioned a little bit briefly that we're going to be talking about potatoes and citrus. I believe that's sort of your specialty. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks, Caitlin. So I started working on potatoes in my PhD, which was many years ago in the late 1990s. And then my career for the first 25 years was on potato diseases. So I focused on various kinds of diseases, soil-borne diseases, wind-blown, insect dispersed, etc. And so I had a long time in the potato industry. And then a couple of years ago, I took a different job and I moved over onto citrus. So this is my 4th year now. I have been doing research on citrus diseases pre-harvest, in other words, before the fruit are picked. So whatever you can find in the orchard, I research some of those, not all of them, but some of those citrus diseases. So yes, potatoes and then citrus, 2 completely different crops.
I have a little personal saying, which is there is not a problem on the planet that can't be solved by a potato,
I
which
like that.
is like if you need a break, like a bag of chips, it's great. I mean, mashed potatoes are like a direct gift from heaven. Potatoes are amazing. So,
Do you
what are
agree?
some of the biggest diseases that affect potatoes that I need to personally be worried about, since potatoes solve most of my problems?
You, as a consumer, don't need to be worried about any problems, because the potatoes that end up on your plate or in a packet or in the supermarket are 100% fit for consumption. You will very clearly see when you're not going to eat that potato. So, for example, if you store your potatoes in a plastic bag, in a cupboard somewhere, and you kind of forget about them, some of them might start sprouting. That's not great. Then you can rather plant it in your garden. But worst case scenario would be that they start rotting. And that's because they don't have the right environmental conditions to stay healthy. And you're not going to eat that rotting potato. Not at all. So there are none that you as consumer have to be worried about. There are, however, a number of diseases that do infect potatoes, but that's basically the farmer's problem. So there are a number of leaf diseases that will reduce yield. There are some tuber diseases, some of which will develop further post-harvest in storage and transport. But yeah, like I say, the potatoes that one buys in the supermarket or that have already been processed are perfectly fine to eat. If they start rotting, one won't want to eat them anyway. If you see some lesions on the surface of the potato, so on the skin, so some spots or something, one can just easily peel it off. It won't have any effect on human health at all. Hope that puts your mind at ease.
It definitely puts my mind at ease. So just coming to citrus, if I think about it, generally speaking, oranges, lemons, I don't really see them with all kinds of spots on their skin. And I want to say that my observation has been that it's more the trees that are generally affected by all kinds of pests. I don't know if those qualify as like I don't know, I suppose it qualifies under the umbrella of plant pathology, but correct me if I'm wrong, if you can maybe just confirm that or debunk that it's more the trees that are affected, or is it also a case of whatever the diseases that could be on the oranges and lemons, those are generally sorted by the farmers? Yeah, that's it. Farmers.
Oh, no, that's perfect. Yeah, you're quite right, Shane. We have a very, very good citrus industry in this country. And again, by the time the citrus fruit or the product gets to the market for the consumer, there's really nothing to worry about. One might here and there see a little spot on a citrus fruit, but you peel it and it's fine. Occasionally, you might find a worm or something in the fruit, but that's very, very occasional. So that's not to say there aren't diseases that affect the fruit, but as you correctly said, these are managed by the farmer. And in most cases, these are just cosmetic symptoms. So in other words, that will maybe cause some lesions on the rind or the skin of the fruit, but it won't affect the pulp, which is actually what we eat. So yes, there are quite a few diseases that affect the tree. Now, the way in which that will be a problem is that it will reduce the yield. So the farmer might not always run at a loss, but he might lose money because he has to control these diseases to ensure that he gets the yield that he wants. But in general, most of the diseases are controlled either on the tree or in the pack house. So there are ways in which the fruit are treated, for example, wax layers, to prevent any infection by pathogens of the fruit. So yes, no, you're quite right. It's the same with potatoes. By the time they reach the consumer, they're perfectly fine for consumption.
Thanks, Jacquie. That makes sense. So what kind of diseases generally attack citrus trees? Just for general information.
Okay, yeah. So most of the diseases that we deal with in South Africa are caused by fungi. So, for example, the one that I work with quite a lot is a leaf spot. It's caused by a fungus called Alternaria. It's very widely spread in all citrus areas, basically on the globe, and it causes spots on the leaves and it can cause spots on the fruit. If it's not controlled at all and it's a very severe infection, then the fruit will start dropping, and that would cause severe yield loss. But once again, even if the fruit are infected, it doesn't go deeper than the skin. But that's the one. So it's basically called it's a spot. It's called a brown spot. Then we have some other pathogens, fungal pathogens. The one, for example, is botrytis, which can infect the flowers. And obviously, if the flowers become infected by a pathogen, then they will drop or they won't produce fruit. So we will lose yield because of a reduction in the number of fruit that are produced. We have a few other fungal pathogens that cause leaf diseases. And then one of the fungal pathogens that is very, very important to us in terms of our export is citrus black spot. So this is also a cosmetic disease. It doesn't actually affect the fruit in any way, but there are some countries that don't want any of the fruit should it have this black spot on it. And therefore, we manage our fruit to be free from this pathogen and free from the disease so that we can still export our fruit to markets that are sensitive to it. So there are a couple of other things. There are a couple of viruses, but in general, it's very well managed in the South African citrus production industry. We have them under control. They're not widely spread. And again, they won't severely affect the fruit. It's normally a yield reduction. Then there's another pathogen, Phytophthora. It's the same genus that caused the potato famine a couple of 100 years ago. And the one that infects citrus can cause a root rot. So it will affect the roots of the plant, and then the plant will start declining. It will eventually die because it can't take up water and nutrients through its roots. But that one is also relatively well controlled, and it's normally in certain areas where there's poor soil or where there's waterlogging in the soil that you see an infection by Phytophthora. Fortunately, there are not hundreds of diseases that infect citrus, and we've got a lot of them very well under control in South Africa.
So if I can just summarize it, general case in South Africa, we've got very different climates, very good climates. So we have environmental conditions that are conducive to proper crop yields for both potatoes and citrus, and by extension, many other fruits and veg. And we have very good measures in place to ensure that whatever gets to the consumer is a quality product, and the diseases that generally affect these different crops or crop types are well managed. And to summarize those, they generally would start with mostly fungi, then bacteria, and then viruses. But again, the consumer doesn't have to worry about that because people like you have that all under control.
Totally. Very good summary. Thank you, Shane.
Can I just point out that Phytophthora is a wonderful name for my next cat? I think I'm going to go with that.
If your cat destroys plants, it's a perfect name.
100%.
The name Phytophthora actually means plant destroyer.
Oh, wonderful. I'm going to remember that. That's amazing. Okay, so there are certain historical events that are sort of defining in some ways to, certain eras and certain populations throughout the world. And one of the very distinctive historical events that a lot of people know about, probably not everyone, but it is quite widely known, is the Great Potato Famine that happened in Ireland, or the potato blight. I think that's quite up your alley when we're talking about your speciality field. Do you think something on such a large scale that happened in Ireland like that could ever happen in South Africa?
That was a very unfortunate confluence of a number of things. And in the 1800s, it was mid-1800s, when it was the major Irish famine, there was no such thing as plant pathology. There weren't researchers looking at plant diseases and microorganisms and how diseases are spread, how pathogens cause disease, etc. We are a lot more informed these days, and obviously the world is a smaller place in terms of technology transfer and knowledge transfer. So the chance something like that will ever happen again, definitely not in South Africa, is very, very slim, because of the field of research of plant pathology and the fact that we're very aware that plants can get diseases just as humans can. So while there might be other diseases that could possibly enter the country in whichever way and cause yield losses or decline in a certain industry, it's highly unlikely that probably the world would ever see such a severe event again, because we know what we're dealing with and we're alert to things that could happen, and we put measures in place to stop something like the Irish famine ever happening again. So no, it's unlikely. As I've said, there are pathogens that are on our radar that we're watching out for, but we will be prepared if and when they ever reach us to combat the specific disease that they might cause. So no, it's unlikely that we'll ever have a type of an Irish famine again.
And would you consider that large potato famine to be a defining moment of your profession of plant pathology? Do you think it had an influence on how it developed?
You've hit the nail on the head. That was basically the start of plant pathology, that Irish famine. So up until then, we really knew nothing about plant diseases. And after the Irish famine, researchers began asking questions as to how and why it happened. And that's why it's actually considered to be the start of plant pathology, because that's when microbiologists and botanists started looking into this to try and figure out what the cause was. And that's when the field of plant pathology was born. So yes, exactly, spot on.
Jacquie, thank you for all the wonderful information. So just to go on to a bit of a lighter tangent, what is the biggest myth about plant pathology, would you reckon? Is there such a thing? Does that exist? Because you know how people know about something or they don't. They know that something like plant pathology exists, plant diseases exist, but because people feel that these things don't affect them directly, they don't think too much about it. But then there are other people who do, and then they might blow it out of proportion. I know that's generally the case with human diseases. I don't know if that also applies to plant pathology.
Yeah, no, I think you are right. Well, I think the first problem is that people don't know that there's such a field. It's not a very common field, and a lot of people don't understand or don't realize that plants also get sick. But then I think there are a couple of other myths out there. The first would be that organic produce is necessarily more healthy than traditionally produced crops. That is not always the case. If the crop is produced according to the correct guidelines and the products are only sprayed, or the pesticides are only sprayed at the recommended dosages and times, then there's really, in terms of health benefits, there's no difference between an organically produced crop and a traditionally produced crop using chemicals. So that's the first myth. And then the second myth is often this idea that the produce has to look absolutely perfect. And if it's not, then it's not healthy to eat. That's also a myth. In most cases, as I mentioned with the potatoes, is if there's a bit of a spot on the skin, you can peel it off. It doesn't mean that that whole potato or that potato is going to make you sick. It's not the case. Plant pathogens don't make humans sick. It's only the case of the toxins that get into them, and that's not very common at all. So yeah, I think those are the two biggest myths that surround the field of plant pathology.
If you say organic crops, do those include genetically modified organisms or GMOs as we know them?
No, the definition of organic is produced without any chemicals, synthetically produced chemicals. GMO is completely different. A genetically modified organism means something that's been changed to give us characteristics that we want. And unfortunately, there's a big stigma surrounding that we need to fight, because if we think about the products or the crops that we currently eat, basically all of them have been modified in some way or another. 200 years ago, maize was not the maize that we know. Potatoes weren't the way we know them now. Tomatoes didn't look the way they did. So what happened hundreds of years ago is farmers would select plants that looked or that produced the yield that they wanted, the fruit that they wanted, the millies that they wanted, whatever, and then they would plant those. And in some cases, they would do pollination with one crop to another, or one plant to another, to try and get better produce. So something that tastes better, something that looks better, something that yields better. So that was the original form of genetic manipulation, was basically taking the pollen from one plant and putting it on another plant and trying to produce progeny with better produce. Then, as time developed and technology developed, we discovered that there's a faster way of doing this, and this is by basically taking certain genes from one specific plant and putting them in another one. Now, this doesn't mean, for example, people often think, yeah, but you've taken a gene from, for argument's sake, a coconut and you put it in a tomato. Or what? That's a bit of a far-fetched example, but it's just to illustrate the point. No, it means saying this plant, this tomato plant in my greenhouse produced really big red tomatoes, juicy. And this other one here I see is resistant to, for example, Phytophthora. So let's take the gene from the juicy tomatoes and put it in the tomato plant that's resistant to Phytophthora. Then we have a plant that's resistant and it produces red, juicy tomatoes. That would be a GMO plant, but it's not dangerous. It's still a tomato plant. It's not going to make you glow in the dark or grow hair on your teeth. Right. So that's the other big myth, is that GMO is dangerous. It's not dangerous. And again, there are many regulations surrounding GMO. So any kind of product that is genetically modified has to go through a number of regulations and checks to make sure that it's fine for production. So no, GMO is not the same as organic, to basically answer your question.
I think what is important to emphasize as well is that, as you've mentioned, GMO is just changing some of the genetics or the genetic material of a certain crop, fruit, veg, whatever it may be. But those changed genes can't change anything in the human body. I mean, it's plants and humans. And also, I mean, you've also just used, maybe in your own words, a silly analogy, but I think a very good one, a coconut and tomatoes. Those would obviously not necessarily be compatible, and those genes may or may not serve a certain function, like they may be active or not, but they may just allow or not allow the expression of a certain protein, which might help the plant to be naturally, I'm quote unquote, resistant to a specific pathogen. Yes. And it's all about making the plants better and more resistant. And then you don't have to use all these harmful chemicals. So yeah, organic versus GMO, correct me if I'm wrong, but organic, yes, being all natural and stuff, but then people might still use certain control measures, which might pose some health risks. And ultimately, GMO is very safe. I know there's a big movement against GMO foods and how that's bad for you, but I think all of that's just based on misinformation.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better. That's exactly correct, Shane. Thanks.
And that is one of our favorite segments that we have that we're bringing into each of our shows, which is called the fake news segment. So thank you so much for clarifying that. Right, we're gonna wrap everything off now, Jacquie. We have one last question for you, which is still in the little fun section, is what advice would you give to the kids who are listening that want to study plants when they grow up?
Go for it. In the field of agriculture in general and plant pathology in specific, you will never be without a job unless you do something to lose your own job. But there are so many opportunities, and it's such a varied field. It's such an exciting field. It changes. You get to meet different people. You get to travel. So if you're considering something in the plant field, plant pathology is definitely something to consider. You won't regret choosing that as a career.
I mean, there's such a wide variety, as we've alluded to and mentioned in the podcast, a wide variety of farming going on. There's also the wine industry. So plant pathology, literally any plant that you may grow. There's also a big horticultural industry, and obviously those plants need to be looked after as well. And we all need to eat, and all those plants, all those vegetables, all those fruits that are imported and exported need to go through rigorous quality control, because ultimately that affect human health and wealth ultimately.
Yeah.
So we need plant pathologists like you. So thank you for sharing your wealth of information. And I can tell that you speak from experience, and you've obviously seen a whole lot in the work that you do. And because you often go to farmers and you educate them and you talk about the issues they face and possible solutions. And that's really what we want to hear from someone with practical experience and someone who actually goes out into the field and not just, know all the information, but practically speaking, they might not have the experience. So thanks for that, Jacquie.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So thank you very much for coming on the show, Jacquie. We really appreciate it. We hope our listeners got something out of it and that they're all smarter after this. And one of my biggest take-homes is that I do not have to worry about my love of potatoes going awry in any way.
Not at all.
We are not on the brink of losing our potatoes. So I am going to sleep a lot better tonight knowing that.
I'm pleased.
So for anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about the field, we are going to have some links up in our show notes on the website. All the links will be in the show notes of the episodes as well. And then we will put some links in for Jacquie's credentials if anyone wants to go and see what Jacquie is about as well. So thank you for joining us for another episode of Science on the Table.